Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is the environmental Kuznets curve. Now, the environmental Kuznets curve was named after this guy right here. This is Simon Kuznets, and Simon Kuznets was an American economist, and he actually won the Nobel Prize in 1971. So this is an economist who has received a lot of attention. Now, he hypothesized this idea that we call the environmental Kuznets curve, and it's abbreviated often as EKC. So if you see that, or you might want to use that in your notes, the environmental Kuznets curve, EKC. But before we jump into this, understand that this is not the thing that really made Simon Kuznets famous. He did work related to inequality, similar kinds of ideas, but this kind of came out of the work that he did on income inequality. Now, what Kuznets was doing was that he was hypothesizing about a relationship between environmental degradation, so how environmentally damaged is a country's environment, and income. So he's saying, look, I think there's a connection between the level of environmental degradation in a country and their income levels. But specifically, he's looking at environmental degradation and GDP per capita. Now think about that for a minute, because we've already talked about GDP per capita. And GDP per capita describes GDP for the average person, right? So it's a good proxy for average income. And economists use GDP per capita to get a sense of standard of living. So his idea is that, look, GDP per capita, which proxies standard of living, the income of the average person, has a connection with environmental degradation. He thinks these two variables are related. Now, specifically, he hypothesized that countries have this relationship that changes over income, that there's a connection between the two, but that we see things happening differently when income changes. When a country starts out early in their development, so we're in the early stages of growth, so they're going to have lower incomes, we see that pollution increases, and of course that means environmental quality decreases. So look at that again. He's saying when a country is in its early stages of growth, so it's lower income, we're going to see pollution actually increasing. So low income, pollution's going up, which means that environmental quality is falling. So in early stages of development, environmental quality is falling. But then you get to these later stages of growth. And in these later stages of growth, we see pollution decreasing. And of course, if pollution is decreasing, then we know environmental quality is increasing. So Kuznets is just making the connection between the level of pollution, the quality of a country's environment, and their income. And over time, we know that countries experience economic growth. And so we're going to see different patterns and different connections based on where they are in their income and growth. This idea has been formally tested. There is formal research that exists. For example, here's a study, and in this study, 2016, they looked at 114 different nations, pulling lots of data. Of course, you have to make sure that if you're using data, it's got to go across both industrial and poor nations, because you're trying to get a sense of whether the connection that's hypothesized by Kuznets actually exists. And they do find the relationship that's hypothesized in the environmental Kuznets curve. We're not going to get into this research, but it does exist. Interestingly, there are other scholars that have hypothesized a slightly different relationship than what I just described. Back to the Brundtland report, there's the Brundtland environmental curve. There's also the environmental daily curve. Some of you may know that particular researcher. We're only going to look at the Kuznets curve. My goal is not to give you an exhaustive lit review of all the different ways to hypothesize this relationship. So let's just keep it simple. But the key idea behind what Kuznets is saying is something that environmental economists point to, and that is wealthier is healthier and better for the environment. Wealthier is healthier and better for the environment. And this is a great quote. Basically, it's promoting the idea that when a country gets wealthier, the environment is going to get cleaner. And that's what Kuznets is basically saying. This right here is the environmental Kuznets curve. So take a second to sketch this out in your notes, and then we're going to dive into this and take a look at what this means in terms of the relationship. Of course, economists are good at this. If you're an economics major, this is second nature, but if you're not an economics major and you're not used to working with graphs, please remember that the first thing you need to do when you're looking at a graph is investigate the axes. What is being measured? So what you see here on the horizontal axis is that we're measuring income per capita. Remember, this is our proxy of standard of living. So as we go to the right, standard of living is changing. On the vertical axis, we have environmental degradation or pollution or emissions or however you want to think about it. Now again, this is a bit of an abstraction, right? Because not all kinds of pollution are the same and we're lumping them together, right? Air pollution and water pollution and all kinds of different things, deforestation, they're all being lumped together on one graph. And so this is not plotting actual data, right? We're showing a relationship. Just keep in mind that as a country moves to the right, they're experiencing economic growth because economic growth is going to increase their income per capita or GDP per capita. So understand that while this graph says income per capita, we're proxying that. We're using GDP per capita. So we understand that this is a U-shaped curve. Let's make sure we understand the implications of this being a U-shaped curve. All right, well, let's divide it at its inflection point and focus on just the left side of the graph. Now, on the left side of the graph, everyone agree you're seeing lower incomes, right? You're at a lower income per capita or GDP per capita. But if you follow the trajectory of the curve, you see that environmental decay, environmental degradation is on the rise. So the left side of the graph says, look, if you're a lower income country, you're not that well developed, you're kind of beginning in your pattern of economic growth, we're going to see more environmental decay. In other words, the environment actually gets worse. But then at some point, you get to a higher income level. And when countries get to these higher income levels, we start to see environmental improvement, which means environmental degradation is decreasing. So we have this U-shaped curve. So at low incomes, environmental damage is going up. At higher incomes, environmental damage is going down. That means there's some inflection point right there at the top where we go from increasing environmental degradation to decreasing environmental degradation. This means there's some level of GDP per capita, there's some level of income per person that a country needs to get to before it starts making this transition. Now be clear, this particular level of income or GDP per capita isn't necessarily the same level for all countries. It's going to be case specific. And the Kuznets curve isn't literally saying, okay, this happens at $9,000, right? There's some estimates and there's been research that's looked into where this might happen, but the idea is that no one country is exactly like a second country. But yet there's some inflection point where we start to see this transition. What might cause this turnaround? Well, we have to give some thought to what's going on, what might cause a country to change its behavior to go from increasing environmental degradation to decreasing environmental degradation. And I like to connect it to something like this. Now, you've seen this before. This is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is just my own idea. This is not coming out of other researchers. But I just want to make some connections here. What constitutes basic needs for people in a country? Well, just like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you've seen before, we've got our physiological needs, and those are most important when you're really poor. So your priorities when you're really poor are food, clean water, having shelter, safety, those things that fall at the very bottom of this hierarchy. And the idea simply is that you're limited in what you can think about. Can you care about the environment when you can't feed your family? I mean, no one sits around when their children are starving and says, wow, I really wish we would work on deforestation and reforestation, right? If your immediate need is feeding your children, then you're not thinking about the environment, and that makes sense, right? Same thing when we think about forests. Does a living tree in the forest have a value to you if you're poor? Especially if a big need for you is fuel or heat, right? You need to heat your house, you need to cook. So you see the problem here. When you're poor, you're trying to meet your basic needs. And can you care about the environment when you can't afford school for your children? If you can't provide the very basic necessities for yourself, there's no way you're thinking about the environment. That is a much more advanced secondary thought, but it only comes after you've taken care of your family. You're able to feed yourself. You feel like you have water, you have shelter, you have safety. So let's make the connection then to this environmental Kuznets curve. Well, when we're on the left side, when we're talking about really low incomes, locals are going to exploit the natural resources. They're going to exploit those things to meet their basic needs, right? You're cutting down the tree because you need it for fuel. This is going to lead to deforestation, right? You are clear cutting because you can't make money off a forest, but you can make money if you plant, if you get involved in agriculture. This is going to lead to overuse of resources. In addition, on top of that, it's possible that for poor countries, with the level of technology available, production may be less efficient. So when a country is just starting in its development path, you're exploiting resources, you're trying to meet your basic needs, you're deforesting, you're overusing resources, you're not using the most efficient processes. But then your country experiences economic growth, incomes are rising. When incomes are rising, we know standard of living goes up, and you're starting to be able to meet your basic needs. And after you've met your basic needs, now you can think about the higher ordered needs, right? You can start thinking about things like environmental protection. But we all agree you can't think about those things when you're simply trying to meet your day-to-day basic needs. It's also possible that as countries become wealthier and they move out of those really low income levels, there might be societal pressure to prioritize things like the environment. People are going to start demanding a cleaner environment. It's going to be something that becomes much more important to them, and there's going to be more willingness to pay for those things that are less environmentally damaging. So people are going to be willing to pay for less environmentally damaging goods and services. So again, their attitude changes, their ability to pay changes, their preferences are changing. On top of that, it might also involve new technologies. As a country becomes richer, right? They have more foreign direct investment, and new technologies become accessible. And when new technologies are accessible, we see more efficient production processes. And that means we're using less resources to do the same level of production. There might also be more investment in research and development, ways to do things more efficiently and also more environmentally sound. And then, of course, as countries develop, those countries have more money to allocate. There's just more financial resources available to put towards environmental protection. So we're back to what we've said before, kind of the fundamental underlying principle here is that wealthier is healthier and better for the environment. When people can meet their basic needs, they can move on to thinking about things that are higher ordered, like environmental protection. Society starts demanding environmental protection. Countries have resources that allow them to start supporting ventures that support sustainability and environmental protection. Let's look at the case of Costa Rica. On the surface, if we're looking at Costa Rica, and I mean without rigorous testing, without pulling data and doing a big formal investigation, this relationship that we've been talking about seems to hold for Costa Rica. We know that in Costa Rica's early history, they show a track record of environmental degradation, and that track record is very clear. Remember what we've already talked about. They focused on expansion of industry, specifically things like coffee, meat. There was a lot of logging. They're giving away land to anyone who will develop it. If you want land, you clear cut it, you put your farm in place, you put cows on the land, and that was the priorities of Costa Rica. What is it all about? Well, promoting exports. You want to be able to export, and these are things that were valued in the global marketplace. But of course, it's short-sighted, and we know that Costa Rica learned its lesson and it adapted. We can look back at things we've already taken a look at. On the left, we're looking at forest coverage, and we see things really change over time. On the right, we see Costa Rica's gross domestic product per capita dating all the way back to the early 60s, maybe even late 50s. And we see this continually upward trend. So in Costa Rica's early history, we see substantial rates of deforestation. Now, this is just one dimension of environmental degradation, right? But it's a really important one. But then we see them turn things around. In the 1990s, early 1990s, we start seeing a lot of reforestation. We start seeing the establishment of reserves. We see bans on development and deforestation. And that really has changed the whole landscape of Costa Rica. Of course, now we see a change in the culture. We see a social demand for environmental protection. Costa Ricans want this. They support these decisions. And they have a willingness to pay for environmental protection, right? You can't demand it if you're not willing to pay for it, right? The money's got to come from somewhere. And now we see nationwide sustainability efforts that you're going to be able to see really clearly when you're in Costa Rica. And of course, now that Costa Rica is a middle-income country, they have a standard of living that allows these financial resources to be diverted into sustainability. And so everything here signals that there's been this major transformation in Costa Rica. So the bottom line, Costa Rica, at least on the surface, seems to illustrate the correlation that we've been talking about in the environmental Kuznets curve, that there is a relationship between GDP per capita and environmental protection, that early stages of growth cause environmental degradation, but that can be turned around once a country reaches some critical level of income per person, some critical level of economic growth where environmental protection can then become a priority. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.